All right, Chapter 9 out of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge will be flight manuals and documents. So, talking a little bit about the Aircraft Manual, or POH, Pilots Operating Handbook, as it's often called. We have, for the aircraft we are flying, with Philip here, we have the Pilot's Handbook from the Chief,
It's pretty small.
which in this case is actually an aftermarket book that we've gotten. Because back when the Chief was built in 1946, they didn't have the manual structure that is talked about in this chapter as far as giving us the information that we need to be able to fly the airplane.
So if someday I were to go out and rent a Cessna 172,
right.
this book would be a lot heftier and much more detailed.
Very
and
much.
So if you're taking lessons and you're not flying in a 1940s vintage tail dragger, you're probably used to a much bigger book, but you're probably jealous because I only have to deal with this one.
So to go over the book first, modern Pilots Operating Handbooks or aircraft flight manuals are divided into standardized sections, and the book that we have for the Chief does follow this format. Section 1 is called just General. That gives general information about the airplane.
It's like the spec sheet.
Yeah, it gives you general specifications, any sort of other general information the manufacturer wants to give you in the front of the book.
Things like wing loading and payloads and cruising speeds and stuff like that. That's what's listed here in ours.
Yep, yeah, and just a general introduction to it. Section 2 is limitations. So this will give us all of our maximum weights, our center of gravity limitations, our speed limitations, any altitude limitations that might apply, engine limitations. Depending on what airplane you fly, this section can be pretty short, like it is for the Chief, or it can be several pages long. Most airplanes, it will also include all of the instrument markings and placards that are on the instrument panel. It'll list those and tell you what have to be in the airplane. The one for the Chief, I don't believe has that information, but most of the newer manuals do. Next we have Section 3, which in the standard format is emergency procedures. So this will have all of our emergency checklists, emergency procedures, and we'll go through how to deal with situations such as an engine failure, an engine fire, engine outlanding, and in of course, again, the airplane that we're flying, the Aeronautic Chief, doesn't have an electrical system, but in your typical Cessna or Piper trainers, things like an electrical failure, a flap failure, all these different things that we need procedures to be able to work through and deal with as pilots in the airplane. Section 4 will go through normal procedures. So this will go through all of the procedures needed to operate the airplane on a normal flight, from the pre-flight inspection, startup, taxi out, takeoff, normal flight, landing, shutdown. And that'll give us all the procedures that we need to follow to conduct the airplane on a normal flight. Section 5, which we'll talk about more in a little bit here. Actually, we'll talk about this in what, from your perspective, will be the video after next.
Aircraft performance.
Aircraft performance. And Section 5 in the POH gives us all of the data and graphs that we need to be able to calculate the aircraft performance, takeoff performance, cruise performance, landing performance, all those numbers that we need to know that we have enough engine power and that we're not too heavy to be able to take off, land safely, and that we have enough fuel to fly the distance that we need to go. The next section will be the weight and balance, section 6,
Which is the next chapter video after this
which
one.
will be the next video.
We'll be diving deep and heavy into that.
Yep. And again, the chief manual that we're using just has a very basic information on the weight, center of gravity, and gives you a form to be able to calculate your weight and balance.
It's very basic.
Other airplanes may have different graphs. Cessna in particular has 2 different ways that they give you that you can calculate weight and balance, and they'll talk about that a little bit in the weight and balance chapter that we're going to do in the next video. The Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge gives you examples from different manufacturers to show you some of the different methods of graphing this information that different manufacturers use. The next section, section 7, which is not actually in this chief manual but will be in manuals for Cessna and Piper aircraft, is a systems description. So that'll give you things like wiring diagrams, fuel system diagrams, hydraulic system diagrams, depending on what kind of airplane you're flying. The chief, of course, the fuel system is pretty simple. You have a tank and one tube that goes to the engine, and that's about it.
It's pretty.
No electrical system.
Unless you're using the back tank, then you have a really long tube with a valve in the middle.
Right. But the chief manual for a 1946 airplane doesn't really give a whole lot of information on that. Section 8 in a modern manual, handling, service, and maintenance. So this talks about things like the tire pressure, what kind of oil to use when you change the oil.
That's not covered in the specs section, like up front?
In this manual it is, but in a standard manual like you'd see for a Cessna or Piper, that would be broken out into a separate section in the back.
Oh, okay. This just tells you the oil capacity. It doesn't even tell you what kind.
Yeah, so more modern manuals in the service and maintenance will tell you all the different kinds of oil that are approved, all the different kinds of fuel that are approved, all the different kinds of tires that may be approved. This manual that we have for the aircraft that we're flying is a little bit more basic, but in terms of the typical Cessna or Piper trainers, again, you'll have information like that in section 8. And then section 9 may or may not be in some different manuals. That would be supplements. So things like if you install a new radio, which is modern radios are complicated enough that they need their own supplemental manual on how to operate them. That would be put into section 9 at the back of the Pilots Operating Handbook. And that pretty much concludes the basic layout of the aircraft manual.
So, question for you.
Yeah.
Back to the section where it's talking about like the emergency, normal, performance, maybe the systems description, probably the systems description and maintenance. Yeah. We don't have that section really in here.
No, we don't.
But say an enterprising person who is restoring one of these wanted to step it up a little bit and throw fuel injection on there just because it's cleaner, it's more efficient, it burns less fuel, it just makes the engine run better. I'm sure there's an aftermarket fuel injection for that motor.
There is not.
Well, all right, let's say put a little different motor on there. That would then all of a sudden things would start showing up under the systems description because now it's got electronics on it.
That would all fall under supplements because that's additional modifications that would be made to the aircraft since its initial
that makes sense, but wouldn't some of the stuff like the wiring diagrams and the fuel filter and fuel pump and all that stuff, would that then have a section under the systems description to be added, or is it strictly in the supplements?
That's strictly in the. It depends a little bit on the manual, but typically that's strictly in the supplements. So if you wanted to, for example, put a larger engine, in the case of the Chief, there is no option for a larger engine. Right. You would need what's called a supplemental type certificate, or an STC, so that each aircraft is certified by the FAA under what's called a type certificate. So that's a certificate that's issued to the manufacturer by the FAA that says you have the authority to build an airplane to this design at this factory, and here are all of the Well, at this factory, it would actually be a production certificate, so that's slightly different. But the type certificate lists the particulars of the design and the standards that it must conform to be airworthy under that design. And if you want to change that, put a different engine in, for example, you will need a supplement to the type certificate. And a supplemental type certificate usually comes with a supplement to the Pilots Operating Handbook to detail the changes. So, for example,
Is it something you have to apply for, or the chances are pretty good that people have already done that, and so it's just sitting there, and when you upgrade the engine, you get the supplement with it?
you have to buy the supplement from the person who developed the engine upgrade.
Right. But you don't have to go to the FAA and say, I want to put a bigger engine on this. The people who did the engine upgrade have already gone through that process
Correct.
of saying it will work
The certification
on this plane.
The certification process, correct. And then you have to essentially license that approval from the people who did the work and buy that.
So when I watched a Trent Palmer video recently from the
Mhm.
Flying Cowboys, he upgraded his engine.
That's different because it's an experimental.
Oh, okay. All right, yeah, that's right. They fly different kinds of planes.
Yeah.
So experimental, you're more on your own.
Correct. Experimentals are a whole different world, but essentially you can do whatever modifications to them that you want within reason, as
Right.
long as it can still pass a annual condition inspection from a mechanic.
So he didn't need to go get this recertification.
Correct. Correct.
Even though it was an option you can get from the factory, I guess, or something. It's been done before,
Yeah.
so it's not new. It just
Right.
okay.
But for
That makes
example,
sense.
on a 172, there's an option to upgrade it from the original 150 horsepower engine to a 180 horsepower engine. And when you do that, there's a company in Kansas that certified. Actually, there's another one out in New York as well, but they both independently certified a modification package for putting the larger engine in the 172.
So when you do, you
When
get the supplement.
You buy the engine and the supplemental type certificate and the Pilots Operating Handbook supplement all from them.
Okay.
And the engine has to be put in exactly as they describe in their process. And then you have to submit all that paperwork to the FAA, and the FAA then sends you back a response saying that yes, it has all been done in compliance with what they have on file, and that yes, you have legally obtained the authorization to do this work, and that you may fly the airplane with that in that new configuration.
That makes sense. Just thought I would throw that out there and ask.
Yeah. So for experimentals, again, it's a whole different
Yeah.
thing. In certain cases with experimentals, if you make a big enough change, for example, if you wanted to put like longer wings on an airplane, the FAA might look at that and say, well, you need to go do a new flight test period and prove that this is going
It's
to
gonna
work.
Right.
But there's no supplemental type certificate because experimentals are not issued a type certificate. They're issued a special airworthiness certificate directly from the FAA rather than a type certificate to a manufacturer.
Okay. Sorry, I just made it muddier than it needed to be. It was a good question.
Yeah. And with experimentals becoming more and more common,
Oh, there's a lot. When we go to AirVenture, that's
Oh, yeah.
like, that's all you see is
Yeah.
experimentals. So-
primarily when you're learning at the private pilot level, you'll be doing it in a certified aircraft. Although with light sport coming along, light sport aircraft are certified differently yet. That's a whole other different than experimental, or what we call Part 23 is the part of the Federal Aviation Regulations under which those aircraft are certified. So you have Part 23 certified aircraft like Cessna's, Piper's, the Chief, and then you have light sport, which are certified under a different process, and then you have experimentals, which are certified on a case-by-case basis. Moving into the documentation that is required to be in the aircraft when we fly, they have here in figure, I'm going to go with 9-9 here on page 9-7, we have the airworthiness certificate. In this case, in this figure, they're showing one for a transport category aircraft or an airliner, but the form is the same for any U.S. aircraft. So it gives you the registration number, the manufacturer and the model, the serial number, category, in this case transport, the chief would be normal or possibly utility,
Okay.
date of issuance, FAA inspector. So this is one of the things that you need to make sure is in the airplane. So the documents that we have to have in the airplane in order to fly it are, we have a mnemonic for that. It's ARROW. So we talked about the airworthiness certificate. The next thing you need is the R in ARROW is registration. So that's actually here in figure 9-8, shows the registration certificate. And once again shows the aircraft registration number, the serial number. In this case, they show one for an experimental, which is interesting. Pitts is a kind of experimental biplane. And then it shows who it's registered to, and this can be either an individual or a corporation.
Or an LLC. And
Yeah.
I see that a lot.
Yep. And then it shows you date of issuance. And this is slightly out of date because it doesn't show an expiration date. It used to be that registration certificates lasted until they were sold. Now you have to apply for them every 3 years. So what you'll see now is you'll see a date of issuance and you'll see a date of expiration. You have to make sure that it's not expired. The next thing that you would need in ARROW is a radio station license. Now, this is not required. It used to be required for all aircraft. It is now only required if you're flying internationally. So if you're remaining within the United States, radio station license not needed, but if you want to go to Canada or Mexico or...
Is that a license for you, the individual,
No,
or
that's
a license for the aircraft?
That's for the aircraft. That
Okay.
certifies the aircraft to be able to have a radio installed.
Okay.
In some countries, there may also be a requirement for the pilot to have that. So I've done some flying in Canada, and I have a Canadian radio station license. I also hold a U.S. one, which is required to fly internationally professionally. So I fly for work, so I also have to have a radio operator's license from the U.S., from the FCC. But I also, because I've done some recreational flying up in Canada, and Canada requires that, I also have a radio operator certificate from the Canadian Ministry of Transport. So depending on what country you're flying in, you may or may not need either.
So your wallet's like this big. All these different licenses and cards you have to have.
I don't usually carry the Canadian ones with me because unless I'm going to fly a Canadian aircraft, it's not required. The first three, airworthiness, registration, radio station license for the aircraft, not the license for the pilot. The radio operator's license for the pilot is something different. And then we have operating limitations, which are listed in the limitations section of the Pilot's Handbook. There are also the markings on the instruments, so red lines, maximum speeds, maximum temperatures, maximum pressures that are red lines painted on the instruments. Those are also limitations. And then any placards that are in the aircraft are also considered limitations. Now, again, since we did talk about experimentals, if you're flying experimental, the limitations are actually on a separate sheet. You're issued operating limitations on a separate sheet from the FAA. And that's, again, because you don't have a type certificate which specifies the limitations. The FAA has to issue specific limitations on a case-by-case basis for experimentals. But typically for private pilot training, again, that's something you're not going to be dealing with very much. And then the final thing that you need is weight and balance data. So this is not specifically, in this case, what's in the POH, although it can be. This will be, in the case of the Chief, we have and in the case of most airplanes, will have a weight and balance form with the documentation that was done by a mechanic at one of the annual inspections at some point. Anytime that you install or remove equipment from an airplane, the mechanic needs to recalculate the weight and balance of the airplane and apply that to the weight and balance sheet that's kept in the airplane. And those are our required documents. So Airworthiness Certificate, registration, radio station license for international flights only, operating limitations, which may consist of a section in the POH and or markings on the instruments and or a separate sheet depending on what category of airplane you're flying, and then the weight and balance data, which will be typically on a separate sheet which has been prepared by a certified mechanic. So those are our documents that we need to carry in the airplane for every flight. In addition to those, we're also required to keep maintenance records for the aircraft. So that's a maintenance logbook, one for the airframe and a separate one for the engine, because engines can be swapped between aircraft by a certified mechanic. So the engine has its own separate maintenance log, and for aircraft that typically have variable pitch propellers, the propeller also has a separate maintenance log because it can be separated from the other two components.
And this is even one of those that the pilot can manually, not the variable pitch is one that you adjust from the cockpit, but there are some of those where you can adjust them
On the ground
just by with the
adjustable.
gauges. Would those have their own logbook for the pilot to? Because I know pilots can do some of those things.
Usually we'll talk a little bit about what the pilot can do here, but usually...
That's probably an experimental plane that has that stuff.
Yeah, that's usually experimentals. In which case that's, again, a whole other can of worms. But when you're talking about doing stuff for the propeller, that's usually major maintenance, and that must be done by a certified mechanic. The entries must be made by a certified mechanic. Now, there are certain things that the pilot can do in terms of maintenance, typically classified as preventive maintenance, and these are listed in the FARs. There is a under Part 43, there's an appendix which lists what a pilot may do. It's Part 43, Appendix A, Paragraph C, lists all the things the pilot may do. And it's a fairly lengthy list, but it includes things like changing the oil, changing the tires, any kind of, adding hydraulic fluid if you have a hydraulic system. All those minor things you need to do.
Stuff that aren't major
right.
things that could really become
right. So you
unairworthy.
Yeah.
Well, not changing the oil can make it not airworthy.
It could, potentially. But adding air to the tires or changing the tires. Also, another thing on that list is changing the landing gear from wheels to skis or back again. That can be done by the pilot.
Floats included?
Or
floats a whole different world?
Floats are a whole other world. And for certified aircraft, that has to be done by a mechanic.
Most people have a float plane, have the wheels that come up and down and they stay. Right? Very few people swap floats to wheels.
Actually, I would say more people do that than have amphibious floats.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like Jeff Plants that we've been up for a ride with. Some people have amphibious floats like that. The disadvantage to those is that they're heavy.
Yeah.
So that float plane that Jeff has would normally be a 4-seat airplane, but they've taken the back seat out because those floats are so heavy that they can only carry 2 people.
And they're made out of carbon fiber.
Yeah.
So I can imagine.
Yeah.
So.
But going from wheels to skis is...
It's pretty much a wash weight-wise, right?
Usually, depending on what kind of skis they are, yes. But that's another thing that can be done by a pilot. But talking about the maintenance, there are certain inspections that we have to have done on the aircraft in order to maintain it in an airworthy state. Now, the owner or operator of the aircraft, in this case the friend of ours who's letting us use the airplane, is responsible for arranging for the aircraft to be maintained and making sure that it's maintained in an airworthy state. However, the pilot in command, that would be one of us, me for now, you after you fly solo or get your license, is responsible for verifying that. You know, because as a pilot, whether you're flying an airplane that you own or you're flying an airplane that someone else owns, you're still, either way, you're responsible to make sure that you're not taking off in an airplane that's not airworthy, which kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
And in order to maintain it in that airworthy condition, there are certain inspections that we have to do. There's a mnemonic for this that we use, AVIATE. So A, V, then there's a number 1 that we use as an I, A, T, and E. So what that is, the first A is annual inspection. So every 12 months, mechanic has to look at the aircraft, do a full inspection, and there are guidelines both from manufacturers and from the FAA about what items the mechanic has to check on each annual inspection. It's usually a pretty long list. Even on an airplane as simple as the Chief, it would take most of a day to do an annual inspection, and on more complicated airplanes it can take 2 or 3 days even sometimes to do an annual inspection. So that's the first inspection we have to have done. The V in AVIATE is a VOR check. That's a check that can be done by a pilot. It's required if you're going to fly IFR, Instrument Flight Rules. So not required for visual flying, but every 28 days there are various different methods to verify that your navigation radio is receiving properly and is accurate. And you have to do that check every 28 days and make an entry in the logbook.
So if you have a plane that's equipped with IFR, even if you're not flying, you got to go out to the hangar and fire it up and check this and log it.
Only if you want to fly IFR though. You can
okay.
You can let that expire. You just can't fly IFR until you go out and do that check.
So if you were down for a couple of months and you can't fly, when you come back out, you just need to do that check, make sure it's good, put it in the book, and then you're good to go.
Before you fly IFR.
So there's no
that's
penalty
correct.
for letting it expire.
No.
Not like some of the inspections where you have to be in under that.
Correct.
Okay, that's what I
correct.
make sure on that one.
So that's the first two, annual VOR check. The next one is the one for the one or the I in AVIATE is the 100-hour inspection. So this is sort of a slightly less comprehensive version of the annual inspection, but it has to be done every 100 flight hours if the aircraft is being used commercially. So if it's being used for compensation or hire, the aircraft has to have a 100-hour inspection. Now, this gets a little bit complicated because if you are flying a privately owned airplane, obviously that's not flying for compensation or hire. If you're just flying it recreationally, so 100-hour inspection is not required. However, interestingly enough, as far as the FAA is concerned, renting an airplane does not constitute operation for hire. So if you go rent an airplane from, say, one of the FBOs around here, that airplane would not be required to be within its 100-hour inspection period. However, if you then also have one of the flight instructors from the same company fly with you, then that is operation for hire, and then they have to make sure the airplane is within that 100-hour window for the 100-hour inspection.
So does that complicate it for the gentleman that owns the plane we're learning in? Is that going to force him into needing a 100-hour inspection this time?
It could, but
if we run the hours
right.
up.
But the airplane would have to fly more than 100 hours in a year, which I don't think
That's pretty regular flying, isn't it?
Right. That's
So if we don't hit the 100 hours, the annual zeroes it back out?
correct. The annual can count as a 100-hour inspection.
So if we we're on our annual, we get it today, then we don't hit 100 hours until next year. When we have our annual, then we're on a new 100. Okay.
Right. And
how that
a lot of privately owned airplanes, and in this case the Chief that we fly, based on how much it's flying, I can't imagine it'll fly more than 30 hours this year. So it's pretty...
Well, we've put 2 on it.
Put 2 on it.
Got a ways to go.
Yeah, so we may we may put 30 or 40 on it, but still, there aren't that many other people flying it, so I wouldn't imagine it's likely to hit 100 hours this year. And if it does get up towards 100 hours, well, then we'll deal with that when we.
But if we hadn't been doing lessons in it, and it hit the 100, he wouldn't have to worry about it.
Correct.
But because we are, it would. Okay.
Correct. Now, the other inspections that we need, so we've got the first 3, AV, annual, VOR, 100-hour, I. Then we need an altimeter system inspection. This is, once again, only for IFR. So, every 2 years, 24 calendar months, you need to have the altimeter checked for accuracy by a certified maintenance shop that is capable of doing those checks. So the airplane that I own personally is not certified for IFR, so I'm not required to do that altimeter system check, because since the aircraft isn't certified for IFR anyway, there's no reason to. But for example, the Corbin Foundation that we've referenced a couple times also has a Cherokee, which is certified for IFR, so they do have to get, in order for the airplane to be able to fly IFR, they do have to have that altimeter system inspection done. If they fail to have that altimeter system inspection, the only disadvantage is that they then cannot fly under instrument flight rules.
And then as soon as they have it, they can start back up. Right?
Correct.
It's not like you're in trouble for letting it go.
Correct. Next one is a transponder inspection. And since the transponder runs off the pitot-static system, same as the altimeter does, those are usually done together at the same time, and they're both 24 months. So those are usually done together. Once again, the Chief doesn't have a transponder, so we don't have to worry about that. My personal airplane that I own also does not have a transponder, so I don't have to worry about that. But for aircraft which do have a transponder, this must be completed in order for the aircraft to be airworthy at all. So if you don't complete that on an aircraft which does have a transponder, that can ground you. Because they're obviously, if they're worried if the if you have a transponder, you're required to have it operating all the time when you're flying, and if you're operating it and it hasn't been checked, then it could be giving an erroneous reading to air traffic control, which could cause all kinds of problems.
Not a good thing.
Yeah, so that is a condition of airworthiness. We also need to have an inspection done on the emergency locator transmitter, the ELT. The Chief does have one of those. All aircraft, with some very rare exceptions, are required to have one, and that has to be inspected every 12 months as well. So you'll notice that the annual is every 12 months, and the ELT is also every 12 months. So those are usually done together as well. So you have 2 that are every 24, 2 that are every 12, and then the 100-hour and the VOR check every 28 days are separate schedules. So that completes our mnemonic of required inspections. Annual, 100 VOR check, 100-hour, altimeter check, transponder, and ELT. And those are the inspections that must be done on the aircraft in order for it to be airworthy or to operate under certain flight rules. In the case of the
And the ELT on the Chief is that brick that
Yep.
the intercom sits on top of.
That's
when you're
correct.
flying.
That's correct. So, obviously the pre-flight inspection, which we do before every flight,
we have that bag of documents behind the seat that has all of those, a lot of those things in it.
Right.
Those
We
documents.
need to make sure that all of the documents are on board. We need to make sure that we don't see any damage to the aircraft, that nothing is visibly in an unairworthy condition. And that doesn't need to be entered in the maintenance logbook, unlike the other
Right.
6, but it does need to be completed because, again, going back to that, the pilot in command is responsible not to take off in an airplane which is unairworthy, so you have to
Yep,
look
you have
at
to
it
make sure.
to make sure that it is airworthy in order to be able to take off. They also talk here about minimum equipment lists, MELs. This is a fairly complicated subject, but suffice it to say, you can develop a document, and this is usually only done by large operators, airlines, large flight schools, and the like, to specify exactly what equipment can be inoperative and the airplane still be legal to fly. But short of that, there's also a provision under the Federal Aviation Regulations, Part 91. The regulation is 91.213, paragraph D, which basically says if the equipment is not required by the basic equipment requirements of the regulations, then as long as you either remove it from the aircraft, which has to be done by a mechanic, or deactivate it by pulling a circuit breaker or simply turning it off, which is something a pilot can usually do, then you can fly with that inoperative so long as you place a placard or a sticker on it that says inoperative. And that's what most private operators and individuals who own airplanes, small flight schools and such might do if there were non-essential equipment that was inoperative. Deactivate it, put a sticker on it that says inoperative, and you can continue to fly until such time as it's practical to get the piece of equipment repaired. Or simply removed. You'll notice if you go rent airplanes at various places, a lot of airplanes still have ADFs, automatic direction finders, which is a very simple navigation radio, but they're in the process of being phased out. There aren't that many transmitters left that they can receive, so a lot of flight schools have just disconnected them and placarded them inoperative because they're really not useful anymore, and then eventually they'll get around to removing them just to save weight because they're useless now.
Yep.
But
Find something else pretty to put in its place.
Exactly. And for all of these maintenance procedures, the required inspections that we talked about and preventive maintenance that can be done by the pilot, so things like oil changes, changing tires, stuff like that, all has to be entered in the aircraft's maintenance log with a description of the work performed and the date and the name of the person who performed the work, either a certified mechanic or the owner or operator of the aircraft, in the case of preventative maintenance, like an oil change or stuff like that. And here on pages 910 and 911, they show
Big long list. Of
fairly long
things.
list of things that you can do. So, removal, installation, repair of landing gear tires, shock cords, shock stress by adding oil, air, both, replenishing hydraulic fluid, replacing safety belts, replacing wheels and skis where no weight and balance computation is involved, cleaning and replacing fuel and oil strainers or filters, interchange of balloon baskets and burners on envelopes for balloons if you fly balloons. Installations of anti-misfueling devices, so there's, in some cases, airplanes have a fuel cap that's big enough that you could potentially fit jet fuel in there, because jet fuel usually has a different shape of nozzle to try to prevent you from putting it in the wrong airplane. But older airplanes sometimes don't have a smaller opening to prevent that. So sometimes you can put a thing in there to prevent you from getting a jet fuel nozzle in a gasoline airplane, which would
Kind of mess the engine up.
it's basically putting diesel fuel in a gasoline car.
It's not a good thing.
Doesn't usually work very well. Removing and replacing, in this case, certain radios.
Right.
Can
Basically have to be snap-ins.
snap in, snap out. Yep. Updating navigational databases in newer radios that require a
where you plug your
database.
computer in and
Yeah,
update
or a
the data.
little SD card or something in the newer
Yeah.
ones, and just update. So there's a whole long list of things that you can do. Next thing to talk about is airworthiness directives. So these are things that are issued by the FAA to say a problem has been discovered with this design, and you need to do a certain maintenance procedure
Kind
in
of like a
order.
recall on a car.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. That's basically what it is. And operators are required to do whatever the FAA specifies that has to be done in order to correct the problem that's been discovered. And at the annual inspection, one of the things the mechanic will do is check that all of those have been complied with or completed. And there is a requirement to keep a record of all of the airworthiness directives, or ADs, that apply to that type of aircraft, and whether they've been complied with and how they've been complied with, or if they're not applicable. There are certain ADs that, so for example, the Cessna 172 is the most produced aircraft in history. It's been produced in about 12 different variants,
Mm-hmm.
and so there may be an AD that applies to only one.
Mm-hmm.
So in your AD record, you might see, a listing for an airworthiness directive, and it might say not applicable because the airworthiness directive may only specify this serial number through this serial number, and if you're outside that range
You
or
don't have to worry about
outside that model year, you don't have to worry about it. But it still has to be documented, and
Mhm. So
it-
it's you've complied one way. or the other.
it would say method of compliance. It would say not applicable,
Right.
because it doesn't apply to that aircraft. Now, if an aircraft, if you've let it get out of more than 12 months from the annual inspection, or certain maintenance problems that may, so for example, say if there was a piece of required equipment, so let's say maybe the fuel gauge was not working. Well, the fuel gauge is required equipment as per the Federal Aviation Regulations. You can't simply deactivate it and placard it inoperative. But what you might be able to do is get what's called a special flight permit from the FAA. Some people call it a Ferry permit. And the local FAA office has the authority to issue these, and they may basically say, well, you can fly the airplane from where it is now to the maintenance shop with the fuel gauge not working, as long as you verify before you take off that you have X number of gallons of fuel.
Yep.
And then
I've seen that done on a couple TV shows. I
Yep.
used to watch that show, Ice Pilots.
Yep.
And they had
And
all
then-
those old DC-3s. They were
Yep.
still flying, and they had one that they had bought that was parked somewhere for parts.
Yeah.
And so they had to go get it actually in flying shape
Yep.
and get a ferry permit to get it back where they could start tearing it apart and using
Right.
it and scavenging it for parts. And
Right.
So
So
it was barely flyable, but they got it back.
right. So the FAA, in the case of the TV show you were talking about, Ice Pilots, that was in Canada. So that'd be
Mhm.
Transport Canada. That would
Right.
be
Same idea.
same idea, but different agency. Would issue a special flight permit, which is usually 2 or 3 pages long, and says
Lots of rules to
Yeah.
make sure you're safe.
you can fly it on this day from this airport to this other airport, subject to whatever conditions they put
Right.
on it. So, in my example, if the fuel gauge was inoperative, they would probably put a restriction on it saying, you have to depart with full fuel or something like that. Which most people are going to do anyway, flying small airplanes.
Yeah.
But
For sure.
in order to fly the airplane, if it's not considered fully in an airworthy condition but is still in some sense flyable, if flying it is required in order to get it to a mechanic where it can be fixed, the FAA can issue that permit to allow you to do that on a case-by-case basis. And that pretty much covers manuals, documents, and maintenance requirements. Any questions on that?
It all makes sense. I had those couple of questions about the 100-hour and
Yeah.
the for hire, and
Yeah.
'cause it's kind of a muddy area in there. So I was just wondering how that affected like the owner of the plane that we're renting
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So it was one of those things I had in my head. So I'm going to have to
Yeah.
ask Jake this one because it just wasn't completely clear to me. How
Right.
that,
And that pretty much concludes what we've got for Chapter 9.